Welcome to the Shapes of Grief podcast. I'm joined today by psychotherapist and author Gill Mann. Jill is author of the book A Song Inside. Uh, it's a beautifully written book, a tribute to her son Sam, who died in 2014. Jill, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Liz. It's lovely to be here.
So I'm not really sure where to start, Jill. There's so much in this book. There's so many themes that you've covered. There's so much profound insights that you've shared. Um, let's start with Sam. Tell us about him.
Okay, Sam. Sam was a very lovable and very tricky young boy and young man, actually. He was an absolute delight, and he was also my greatest challenge in life because he was just always a little bit different and pushed at the boundaries. But he was very funny, he was wacky. He just had a sort of take on life that meant life was never, never dull when he was around. Um, he's the middle of my three children. So I have an older daughter and a younger daughter. And Sam, I would say, was a fairly classic middle child, sort of struggled to find his place a little bit. Um, And when he was in his sort of late teens, he started to show signs of being unwell. And what we lived through then for a sort of 4 year period, which was immensely confusing and really terribly sort of discombobulating because we didn't know what was happening to him. We didn't know whether he was just being a slightly more extreme version of the sort of boundary pushing young man that he'd always been, or whether actually he was perhaps becoming unwell. So that was as a family, that was enormously challenging. In also very difficult for Sam because he didn't feel that there was anything at all wrong with him. And so we lived through this 2 year period initially where his behavior became stranger. As I said, he'd always been wacky. He was always someone who sort of thought outside the box. But his behavior did become quite odd. He started to live in a downstairs room, really stopped using his bedroom, ate in there, insisted on cooking his own food, became extremely sort of fussy about what he would eat, what he would put into his body, very sort of spiritual, which, so many of the things that happened to him actually are sort of normal to a certain extent, but it was the degree that Sam always he took everything to that was the slightly sort of baffling thing. And in time, he started to show signs of psychosis.
Yeah. I mean, Jill, just there, what you're saying, I found as I was reading this part of the book, it's quite fascinating actually, because I know so many people who fit the description of Sam and his way of thinking in
Yeah,
terms of sort of the anarchist, if you like, fighting against the system, being vegan or vegetarian and then vegan and then raw food only, very controlling, around what's eaten,
mm,
judgmental about others who maybe don't follow their way of being and thinking,
mhm,
sleeping under the moon, um, gemstones, all these
yeah,
things that he was bringing into his life. And like you say, this spiritual quest. And I think certainly for me, sometimes I look at people similar to Sam and think, are they highly evolved spiritual beings or unwell? And sometimes it's a very fine line. But what you say is it's the degree to which Sam took it.
I think it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's the difference between someone being able to keep themselves safe, still following these sort of, whatever guidelines they give themselves, whatever beliefs they have. And I mean, everything that Sam sort of did and, sort of took into his life, it was there on the internet. You know, he was part of a community of fellow believers. You know, he felt that no one should drink drinks that came out of plastic or food that came out of plastic. And, you know, every so often I read something and I think, oh my God, Sam, he was right on that. Sam was right. You know, he really did know his stuff, but it was the extreme lengths he took it to. And really the sense that the point came because he was a bright young man and really, you know, always stimulating company because he thought in such a sort of slightly off the wall way, but you know, he was very good at putting his case for things. And he 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 really did believe that he was okay, and it was heartbreaking in a way to have to tell him that we thought he wasn't. um
And you could almost say, like, to whose rules are you okay or not okay? You know, we live in a very broken society. And I don't know, one of the great philosophers said, it's no measure of health to fit into the society we've created today. Well, the philosopher said it much more eloquently than I am. But, you know, there's truth in so much of what Sam thought and said, but it's just so incongruent with the society he was trying to live in. And this is why he returned again and again to travel and the islands, and where he could meet, you know, fellow travelers of his path as such, right?
Absolutely. I mean, really, he took to going away on these trips to Thailand, to Hawaii, and he met people who absolutely shared his beliefs, and he saw it as a spiritual quest. So, and he also argued forcibly, sort of against the sort of system that I, you know, in my sort of rather unthinking way, just sort of followed, going to university, studying, you know, getting a profession, all that sort of thing. He said, no, I want to do things differently. I want to develop my mind. I want to develop really the sort of spiritual aspects of myself.
And he was able to do that because you mentioned in the book he had inherited some money. So he was able to take that and use that to follow and do what he wanted to do.
He was. He
Yeah.
was, yeah. And it brought him, I mean, for me, actually, because every time he went away, it was absolutely agonizing for us as a family, because we really weren't sure that he could keep himself safe when
Yeah.
he was away. But on the other hand, there was literally nothing we could do to stop him. I mean, we could have sort of burnt his passport, cut it up, or hidden it, but actually that would have just been a delaying tactic. And ultimately we felt the loss of trust that he would feel towards us at that point would be more damaging actually than letting him go and trying to stay in touch with him and making sure as best we could that he was okay while he was
Yeah.
away. So it was absolutely agonizing to let him go. And yet, as he did become ill, um, and iller, and in the end, he was he went into the sort of the health system, because we asked the local community health team to get involved, and particularly the early intervention in psychosis team, who felt that he might be showing signs of schizophrenia. And ultimately, that is the diagnosis he ended up with. And it was absolutely heartbreaking. He never accepted it. He never accepted that there was anything wrong with him. And that's partly because one of the symptoms that quite a lot of people experience who suffer from schizophrenia is this thing called anosognosia, where they actually lack the awareness. Something happens in their brain which stops them from actually realizing that their behavior is changing. You know, they lose the ability to actually look at themselves and see what's happening.
That's
So
something. Yeah.
It
It
was terribly hard, but by letting him go off traveling and then letting him sort of come back when he'd had enough, which, you know, he did, and he always found his way home because he was a real sort of homing pigeon at heart. You know, home was sort of where he grounded himself. And I was so glad, you know, when the worst thing happened and actually we discovered that Sam had died on his fifth trip, his final trip. Um, it, I was so glad. I mean, that sounds bizarre, but I was glad that we had allowed him to keep that identity, alive, where he could see himself as a traveller. And even though it went, you know, wrong in the worst possible imaginable way with him not coming home from one of these trips, I can't really find it still in my heart to regret the decisions that we made. And as I said, we couldn't actually stop him anyway. So really, all we could do was try to support him while he was
and
away and let
we
him.
all know we all know that
Yeah,
that worst possible outcome could have happened in your spare room or in the green room
absolutely.
or in the local motorway. You talk in the book about the neighbor calling you to say she just wanted to let you know she saw him in the middle of the intersection, very scantily dressed. So Sam was going to be in a precarious situation wherever in
He
the world he was.
he was.
Yeah, and I think it really comes across just the, that expression stuck between a rock and a hard place that you find yourself in, because he comes across as such a strong character, Jill.
Yeah,
He made up his mind and there was no unmaking it. And also getting care in the community was really hard for you. You kept on pulling in people to try and help you and help him, and Sam was never bad enough to be sectioned. He was never ill enough to be sectioned.
yeah,
um, Yet you and your daughters and Paddy and his dad knew that this was not your Sam in the way you had known him before, and something profound was happening to him. I think it really struck me, that image you painted, Jill, of him sleeping in the green room rather than his bedroom with the shutters open, and just the control around him and what he ate and what he thought and what he did and wouldn't do, and urinating into bottles and his clothes getting dirty and his hair going into dreads. And we've all read those articles that say if you don't wash your hair, it'll start to clean itself
yeah,
naturally. But
yeah.
it's almost like Sam had consumed every single possible article about every single possible thing and was trying to apply it all to himself.
That's so true. It was. I mean, he was such a child and a young man of excess. You know, the thing with Sam was he never did anything by half. So, you know, he got into all these sort of tinctures and things like spirulina, which, you know, I'm sure are incredibly health giving. But he wouldn't then follow directions on how much to have. So he could literally consume an entire sort of bottle of tinctures in a day. And that was where somehow he'd lost. I mean, he never really had it, to be honest, because he always was this quite extreme uh, little chap and teenager. But it definitely, you know, it got worse. And yeah, I mean, it was absolutely heartbreaking to have to. It was heartbreaking actually to feel sort of glad on some level, you know, some sense of relief when he was finally sectioned, because it was, and this was selfish on my part, but you know, at that point I was desperate. I was desperate that somebody else was seeing what I was seeing, you know, in terms of the sort of medical community. And so there was real relief in feeling actually somebody else recognizes that all is not well here.
Yeah.
and feeling that it wasn't just our responsibility as a family, because it's terribly hard in those early phases of certainly with Sam, the way it happened was sort of phases of psychosis that came and went,
Yeah.
and he was happy. I mean, that was the other unusual thing about the sort of presentation of his illness, is that he was on sort of cloud nine all the time, and he wasn't being sort of persecuted by inner demons at all. He was being entertained, and he had never been happier. So for him to be sectioned and effectively incarcerated against his will, it was on a locked ward, and it was utterly devastating.
Yeah.
So
And back to the impossible, Jill, that you were faced with. Neither option was neither option was palatable, if you like. You used the word selfish there, but I would say human. Of course, you needed that relief to just have somebody else step in and support you in what you're going through. And it comes across, I took some notes here. Um, you said somewhere, somehow as a mother, I should have known what to do, but I didn't.
mhm,
And it's almost like I felt an anger in me reading that at what society has painted as what a mother should be.
mhm,
This is a little bugbearer of mine.
yeah,
The image that we have of how a mother should be, this know-all mother, this loving, limitless mother who can just give, and we are only human. And when did suddenly the weight of the world and everybody's mental health and everybody's well-being suddenly go onto mother's shoulders? And we know in therapy it's always mother issues. you
so
know why is suddenly all of this our responsibility? And I think when you wrote those words, somehow as a mother I should have known what to do, I felt so angry with the world on your behalf, that you thought this was all down to something you should do or not do.
yeah. But I think as a mother, we do feel it, and I mean, of course, that is partly the external pressures. We are sort of somehow fed this idea that we should have all the answers, but I suppose also there's an internal feeling in every mother, I think, that somehow what you're born to is to keep your child safe. That is all you want for them, really. When it really when the chips are really down, what you want above all else is for them just to be safe. And it felt as though, yeah, as though I couldn't
I
fulfill
think,
that.
yeah, and you mentioned in it as well about your two daughters and the telling of Sam's death to them, and you write, I failed them both. As they held with each other. I think one was on the phone, one was beside you, and the same thing is there. Well, what about you? Who was showing up for you? Even when you told his dad of his death, you did that wrong too.
Yeah.
And it's just a theme that I was picking up of, gosh, we're failing mothers. We're expecting women to be the axis of everybody's world, and we are just human.
Of course.
Your humanity screams out on every page, Jill.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You write about, and it's the hours or days just after you learned about Sam's death, you said, nothing feels real, going through the motions of living life.
Mhm.
Would you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that sensation that so many people describe?
Yes. It was just a bizarre feeling, really. I didn't really feel as though I was in my body. I know that sounds sort of a little bit mad, but I didn't really seem to be entirely present with myself. And of course, I understand why, because being present with myself was simply too painful, because it meant being really up against this terrible knowledge that Sam was dead. And because he had died abroad and his body had not been found initially, it was very, very difficult. It meant we never saw his body. And I think that was a very tough aspect of my particular process. And everybody has their own tough aspects. I'm not trying to say that this made it worse, but for me, it was very hard not to have seen Sam dead. Actually, to have that, that reality of a body that was Sam that did not any longer contain his spirit.
Yeah, and you put a lovely quote in the book. I don't remember who it was by. Do you remember the quote of the man who said,
Oh, I do.
the people who are lucky to be able to hold their loved ones' bodies?
Yes, it was. Oh yeah, there we go. Nicholas Walterstorff.
That's it.
He wrote a book, Lament for a Son, and I think this is really true of many grieving parents, is that actually there is so much solace to be found in reading of other people's experiences. Grief is such a lonely process. It's lonely even within the context of a family, even when you're mourning the same person. Actually, everybody's loss is different, and you all hit different sort of low points, sort of less low points, really unbelievably low points, at different points, in your grieving process. And it's actually, it means that each of you just feel like you are on your own sort of journey. And I think that actually is a really painful aspect of grieving within the context of a family, that even though you're all suffering the same loss of the same person, it actually is a different experience for each of you.
Yeah, and everybody grieves so differently as well.
And everybody grieves so differently. But there is something about then reading another parent's account of their experience that is incredibly reassuring, actually.
Yeah.
And some of the letters and responses I've got have received, since the book was published, since A Song Inside was published, have been, actually the things that I'm reading about that you felt are things I feel too, and it's made me feel normal. I'm so grateful. I don't feel mad anymore.
Yeah. And it's so true, Jill, what you're saying about, how you can have a family of 4, a family of 6, and they all feel so alone, because one of the things that seems to happen when we have a shock like this or a loss like this is the self as we know it disintegrates.
Yeah.
The self as we know disintegrates. So it's not like Jill and Paddy and Ellie, as they are taking this news, it's like everything about you internally shifts places, dissolves, falls away, gets thrown in the air. I mean, there's a million different metaphors to describe it, but so many people talk about just that complete disintegration of themselves. And the grieving process then seems to be trying to find pieces to put back or grow new pieces, where you need to. It reminds me a little of childbirth. When you're giving birth to a child, it doesn't matter what music is playing, how many supportive midwives are there, how fabulous your partner or friend is. At the end of the day, it's you and your body and your muscles and whatever internal strength you can find to push out that child, and nobody can do it for you. And I think that's part of the pain of grief, is nobody can do it for you. Nobody can fix it or soothe it or take it from you. At best, we can ease it by being a kind present. At worst, we can exacerbate it or throw oil on the fire, but
Yeah.
nobody can fix it.
No,
And
it's
we know that when you're that grieving person, and it's very painful when people try to fix it rather
yeah,
than bear it with you.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what any grieving person needs, is just the feeling that other people understand, that they, and actually not just understand, it is actually that capacity to bear, that they can bear to hear about, or even sometimes to feel your pain with you. Because and I think that's one of the things that does sort of assuage the loneliness a little bit, is that feeling of being held in mind by other people. And I discovered that, was an enormously important part of what I regard as the sort of the good grieving aspects of my grief. That
Hmm.
actually, you were talking about people sort of disintegrating, and I think I mean, for me, it wasn't so much disintegrating as just this sense that I would never be the same person again. I would be a different me. My life would be a different life. Our family life would be different. Everything about it just feels wrong to start with. As a mother, you are the mother of, I was the mother of Sam, of Rosie, of Ellie. That's who I was. And suddenly it seemed on some level as though I was not the mother of Sam anymore. But of course, I'm still the mother of Sam. I will always be his mother, and he will always be my son. And actually, he will always be a part of this family. And he is always with me. There's not a single day that goes by when I don't think of him. And it's not that far off 7 years now since he died. But he's absolutely a presence in my life. But for me, the grieving process is about learning to go through this sort of dual process of both letting go of the Sam that I did have in my life, which included this physical presence, but also holding on to holding on to him. I mean, I do feel he's a huge and active part of my life still, and continues to bring me joy. But those early years of grieving were all about pain, and I think sometimes we try to sort of take shortcuts in grieving. We want to get to the bit where we feel all right, and it doesn't work. We have to go through the pain. We have to go through the difficult feelings, not just sadness, because grief, it's not just about sadness. It's about anger, it's about confusion, it's about envy, um, because there's so many other lives carrying on around us, people who still have their sons, people who are a really important part of my life, family and friends. And I didn't want to shut myself off from those people, because I knew that they were enormously important to me, and actually they were also the people who would keep Sam alive for me, because Sam had been part of their lives. But actually, I can see that it would be terribly easy to start to push people away, because it's simply too painful to be confronted with other lives sort of carrying on. And of course they do. They do. And we all flew out to Thailand, which is where Sam had been when he died. And we had this rather wonderful Buddhist ceremony in a Buddhist temple. And it was both wonderful and both absolutely hideous, because it didn't have any of the sort of familiarity of
Yeah.
the sort of service we would have had if we'd been here.
You describe the boys carrying his coffin in their flip-flops and dirty t-shirts and almost stumbling with it,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
you're
it was.
standing there going, this is awful and wonderful.
Yeah, it was. It was everything, and in a way, that is what life is, isn't it? It is both wonderful and awful, and
That's
I
kind of what Sam was
and
also,
it's what Sam
isn't it?
was.
Yeah,
It is what Sam was. Yeah, because he was
yeah,
impossible. He was an
yeah.
impossible human being, but he was also an absolutely enchanting one.
Something you said earlier, Jill, about well, you say it in the book a couple of times. I only knew Sam alive. I didn't know him dead.
Yes.
And you mentioned this 2 or 3 times in the early part of the book. And then you also talked about not seeing his body. This is a big deal, isn't it, for people who are grieving, or for some people who are grieving, the importance of seeing their loved ones' remains. Would you say that it had any impact on your ability to accept the reality of the loss, not seeing his body?
Yes, I think it did. I think it did because I mean, I did both accept it and didn't accept it. So, and I sort of knew that there was that sort of process going on inside me. I, I mean, when the young policewoman who came to tell me that Sam had died said that they had found a body and that Sam's passport was with it. Now, it so happened that Sam's passport had been stolen a few days earlier, and so of course I was convinced that it was somebody else's body with that passport. And I understand why I needed to just hold on to that in that moment, because it was a moment of absolute trauma of this young policewoman who I thought had come to talk to me about a burglary, suddenly starting to talk about my son.
It's too
You,
much for the psyche to take in.
it is too much for the psyche to take
Yeah.
in. So I needed to sort of just build a little bit of a sort of padding around me, and for that, just for those few minutes while I was waiting to find out exactly which passport it was, um, that was enough for me to sort of arm myself to some extent. But one of the things I really struggled with was I wanted to carry on sort of being a mother to Sam. I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing him. This sounds quite irrational. I think it probably was quite irrational. But I had this thing about wanting to go and be at the airport to meet the plane that he should have been coming back on, because I had all those details in my diary, and that day inexorably ground round, and I wanted
He
I
was due back in June, wasn't he?
was due back in June, and
Yeah.
he was due back on the 22nd of June, because he always chose 22s, because he was born on the 22nd.
And part of his illness as well was repetitive patterns and number sequences as well that he insisted on. Isn't that right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
he did. So
Mm.
um, I just had this sense that I should go and sort of wait for him, just in case there had been this terrible mistake.
Mm.
And I knew it was irrational, because by then I actually had the replacement passport that he had been issued with in Bangkok. So I mean, I had it. I knew he couldn't travel without a passport, and yet, there was this slightly mad feeling, and I think it was because I hadn't been able to see his body. I'd
Yeah.
never seen it. I hadn't seen a photo of him dead. Even that might have made a difference. I mean, it would have been deeply, deeply painful too. But there was something about that not knowing that sort of, yeah, it was both. I mean, I'm sure it was a sort of defensive maneuver on my part, an
Yeah.
unconscious wish to hold on to this hope, to reject this terrible reality. But I think it was also something to do with that sort of maternal role. I mean, it sort of broke my heart to think of Sam arriving and me not being there. And I knew he wasn't going to arrive. So I knew it was sort of bad. But I had this absolute tussle with myself where I made myself go through the process of I allowed it as a possibility that I was going to go to the airport and meet him. But actually, as soon as I'd allowed it as a possibility, I could then start to think about the reality of that, of what that would actually mean. It would mean
Yeah.
sitting there, it would mean seeing happy reunions, it would mean watching other mothers' sons arrive and give them a hug. It would mean waiting, how long would I have waited? What basically, by sort of allowing it to be a possibility and being quite conscious about my thinking about it, I sort of got to the point where I was able to say to myself, do you know what? You don't need to do this. You don't need
Mm.
to go. Actually, you can accept that Sam is not coming home. It's the
But it
date.
sounds like it was a really important process for you to go through.
I
I
think,
think, you know, William Warden talks about the 4 tasks of mourning, and the first task is to accept the reality of the loss.
yeah,
And I think to get there, we have to play these scenarios over in our head,
yeah,
and for the outcome to not be what we want, for us to, it's almost like we have to lose them 1,000 times
yeah,
over and again, over and again. You know, we think they're going to walk through, oh no, they're not, they're dead. Is that them? Oh no, it's not, they're dead. I must ring, oh no, I can't, they're dead. And I think all of this is part of that slow, gradual acceptance that
yes.
they are gone. They're
I think it is. And I think because of my work, and I've worked, as a psychotherapist with a lot of grieving people too, and with mothers actually who had lost sons, um, I knew what can happen if you don't face the pain of loss. If you can't really get to that point of acceptance. So I made myself face it head on, and I think that's partly what my writing was about initially. It was actually, it was a way, it was a way of making it real, and it was also a way of talking to Sam, which again sounds a little bit mad, but actually, as you know from the book, part of the book is a sort of one-sided conversation with Sam. I'm sort of addressing him, and that, again, that was an enormously important part of my grieving, because I was revisiting, not just his death, but actually these difficult 4 years of his illness. And I needed to do that. I needed to make my peace with those, with what had happened to Sam, and the Sam that we had ended up with once he was being helped with medication, uh, who was absolutely delightful again and able to take care of himself. Um, so in a way, I had to sort of go through all those different stages of Sam in order to get back to the young man that I did wave off at the airport that day. And actually, that was the one time that was his fifth set of travels where I actually felt he would stay safe.
Mm.
Uh, and of course, I mean, it's the one where he didn't make it home.
Jill, reading the book, it was hard reading about Sam's illness. It was hard reading or feeling your loneliness in it and your helplessness in it. I don't know which was harder to read about, actually, his death in a cabin in Thailand alone, or his life in your house, and what that was like for all of you, for his sisters as well. Would you talk a little bit about the grief of that? Because again, for so many people, we think about grief associated with bereavement and a death, but there's a lot of people living with chronic grief. And actually, as I was reading your book and reading about Sam at home and the different scenarios and situations you felt yourself in over and over again, what amazed me was how you showed up for your son again and again and again and again. And I was reading that going, oh my God, I'm not sure I could be that mother. She is amazing. Your perpetual showing up for him, but the hardship was so clear. And I was thinking of this mom that I know whose son has a similar illness, and she would describe her life as living in hell a lot of the time, not knowing what's around the corner. What's he going to do next? Will he be okay? When will she get that knock on the door? It's like living in, we know that in chronic grief, when someone dies and we're in that or acute state of grief, the nervous system is shot. It's like the volume is right up there, and it's really hard to be in that state. But some people living with serious illness are in that state for years. And it sounds like that was a space you held for years alongside Sam.
It was, and it was an intensely difficult space to be in.
Hmm.
It really
Yeah.
was. And actually, at the time that I was living through that, I started to write because I have always written at difficult points or at high points of my life when I've traveled and things. I've always found putting words onto paper or onto a screen now enormously sort of, I don't just really helpful. It's really part of how I sort of cope. But when I started to write when Sam was ill, I I I couldn't. I literally couldn't. I had this really sort of visceral response to it. I sort of couldn't bear to, because I couldn't bear to see it in black and white. It was so painful. So it was, I mean, it was a time of enormous loss. As you say, grief is it. We feel grief when our best friend, when we're 4 years old, won't let us sort of sit down at the table with her because she's now cozied up to, another friend instead of you. That is a loss. And I think, uh, it's how we learn to manage loss all the way through our lives that is what either serves us well or not so well when big things happen in our lives, because most of us face some sort of big loss at some point in our lives. And I suppose my training, because I had already trained as a therapist by the time Sam started to become ill, that was enormously helpful. Just that the things that I had learnt, and my own therapy obviously as part of that process of training, that really helped me. I think the other thing that actually helped me during that time was that I carried on working, and I found that I was absolutely able to be present, 100% present with my clients, my patients during that time, whatever was going on in the rest of my life. And that was actually enormously sort of grounding for me. And it was bizarrely a sort of almost a joy to to not be having to face my own problems for
Hmm.
those 50 minutes of a session.
I can relate to that. It's like it just comes out of us, doesn't it? We're able to show up
Yeah,
despite what might be happening in our own homes.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that, yeah, and that sort of gave me hope in a way that I would be able to cope. But I think the hardest thing when you're living with someone who is unwell and with a an illness like schizophrenia that actually makes them unpredictable and their actions unpredictable is that you are living, literally, you're on a knife edge the whole time. And I think that's what I do say in the book, that in a way, I discovered that my moods were totally dependent at various points on how Sam seemed.
Yeah.
You know, if he seemed sort of cogent and engaged and um, back to the young man we all sort of knew and loved before he became ill, um, it, I would feel fantastic. And then if he showed signs of being unwell again, it was sort of unbearable. You know, I didn't want to see it. There was a part of me that so didn't want to see it.
Well, it's like living with this constant threat over you. And although you knew that Sam wasn't going to hurt you, it's our bodies respond as though it's a threat when someone we love isn't right.
Yeah.
And they're being unpredictable and we don't know what's around the corner. We're living under threat.
Yes.
Hmm.
We are, and I just, it was such a terrible sort of feeling not to know, you know, what the next day would hold, you know, and which was sort of how it felt every day, really. So I think that my work was enormously
Hmm.
sort of grounding for me, and obviously the rest of family life. You know, the fact that I did have Ellie who was at home, and you know, studying for GCSEs and then A levels. Um, you know, again, that was, and this is part of what you were referring to earlier. This, what we do as a mother is we try to make everything sort of okay for other people. So I suppose if I wasn't worrying about Sam, then I was worrying about either Ellie or Rosie, my older daughter, who was away by then. Um, and but you know, it does at least give you another focus, because it's very hard living alongside, um, I was going to say madness, which doesn't sound like a very kind word, but I don't mean it in an unkind way, but that sort of unpredictability, um, it's enormously draining, and it's just exhausting. I don't think
Was it all consuming, Jill? Do you feel that it consumed your lives for those years?
it was all consuming, and yet life did carry on. And I suppose in a way that's also been my experience of grieving for Sam, you know, after his death. So even though, yes, it is all consuming, because it's such a massive thing that's happening in your life, that there are times when it literally, there is nothing else you can think about, and it is overwhelming. But but at the same time, life does carry on, and that sort of thing about, I don't know, just the fact that the sun comes up every morning, that the dark turns to light, that the seasons change. You know, in the early months of grieving, that felt like a real insult. I couldn't bear it. I didn't want time to keep moving forward.
Mm.
But actually, as time went on, there is something incredibly comforting in the fact that there is this bigger world
Yeah.
out there which does keep on turning. And
Gives you perspective and grounding.
yeah, and for
Mm.
me, nature and walking was such important sort of parts of my
Mm.
grieving. And
I,
the kindness of others is amazing how healing that is. And I, I can't sort of say to anyone who is perhaps around someone who has lost someone recently, just knowing that someone is thinking of you is, it, you know, it goes some way to, it doesn't take the pain away, but it somehow it just softens it for a moment. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Jill, did you find after Sam died that you had conflicting emotions about it? You know, having lived with such difficulty for so many years. I mean, here's your son who you love and adore, who
yeah,
has died, and it shouldn't have happened. No mother should face that. But yet, also, here's your son who caused such unease at home and
yeah.
such worry and threat.
Do you know, in a way, I couldn't, I couldn't welcome it for myself or the rest of the family, because actually we all loved Sam so much that actually I couldn't sort of welcome it for ourselves, but I could welcome it for Sam,
Mm.
because what I felt was his life would have been difficult. It would have become more difficult. It wasn't the life he wanted to live. You know, he always had these grandiose ideas about himself. You know, he could hotwire a car when he was sort of 6, according to him, and split the atom when he was 12. You know, he was full of those sorts of things. Yeah, he was a lovely, he was wonderful. But I could, you know, I knew that the life that he was facing, which was a life where it was within a system of sort of mental health provision, a system of social care, you know, none of which he either welcomed or actually felt he needed. That was going to be very tough. And I could see his contemporaries, his sisters, you know, they were all going to outstrip him in terms of what they did with their lives. And I knew his life would be reduced from what he had expected it to be.
He was
So
going to stay very young, wasn't he?
yeah, and
Yeah.
you know, he was doing something he loved. Um, so yeah, I don't think that I could sort of feel relief on my own part, but what I also became aware of was how much less anxious I was after he died.
Yeah.
It was actually very painful to have to acknowledge in myself that actually
Mm.
my anxiety levels had dropped, because in a way the worst had happened.
Yeah. I've
Um,
heard that from other bereaved mothers, Jill, as well. When you're living with ongoing illness, whether it be physical or mental illness, it's like that threat, that level of anxiety, that not knowing, sustaining that for so long is excruciating. It's torture. It can be torturous.
yes,
And then when the child dies, it's like the grief is massive, but the layer of torture is gone, and
yeah,
there can be a relief in that. So it's just sadness or just grief or just appropriate anger, but it's that unknown factor, which is just like I don't even have the words for it. I'm doing this with my hand. Just this ongoing torture, not knowing, hitting at you constantly, keeping the volume up of your nervous system and
yeah.
keeping you activated constantly. It's not sustainable.
It's
We're
not sustainable.
programmed to experience stress for a couple of minutes at a time and then to come back to a place of being settled, and
Yeah,
to live with that chronic stress for months or years is so difficult for any human.
it is. It is really difficult. So I think, you know, there was that aspect of relief. And I suppose the other thing is, you know, I mean, none of us, I think, can imagine a worse loss than losing a child. You know, it is every parent's sort of nightmare. It is a sort of, and I think to discover that actually one is still able to put one foot in front of the other, that that you know, however sort of painful it is, however overwhelmed at times one is, but that feeling after a couple of years of actually, well, I am still here. am still here, and actually I am surviving this, and I am finding a way of not moving on, because that's an absolute sort of abhorrent thought to, I think, anyone who loses someone. You don't want to move on from it, because that implies leaving them behind, but you want to move forward. You want to move forward. I mean, to me, that is the sort of definition of healthy grief, really, is that ability to move forward. And
Moving forward with rather than moving on from.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Moving forward with, with Sam, like I was saying, as
Yeah.
as a part of my life, a new, different part of my life.
Where is he for you today, Gill?
I don't know where he is, actually. Yeah, I haven't really. Well, funnily enough, he was right here on my screen, because I watched a little video of him that I have on my author website, and it's something that his dad put together, and it's really lovely. It's only 3 minutes long, and in preparation for this, I just sat and watched it and sort of had him back with me for a few minutes. Yeah.
You
But
still miss him?
oh, absolutely.
Mm.
Absolutely. Every day. Yeah, every day.
What would you say to somebody who's experiencing a fresh loss and listening to this, Gill?
I think I'd say that try not to be scared of the pain.
Mm.
Try not to be frightened of it, not to be frightened of that feeling of overwhelming grief, which will sort of hit you at certain times. Actually, just sort of accept it and go with it. Don't fight it. Don't fight it. I would say be kind to yourself. Do the things that normally help you. For me, that was walking. It was writing. Draw on the things you know about yourself, which actually make life easier. And I would say, do reach out if you're struggling. There are people who can help. There are therapists, there are bereavement counsellors, specialists who really do understand, and talking about it, processing it in some way is really, it's so important. That is the work of grieving, is allowing yourself to think about these things.
Make space for it, for sure.
Yeah, make space for it, and actually try to hold on to hope. I don't really know what I mean by that, other than, I suppose, sort of hope that you will find a way through it. And I think actually that is one of the things that came through in my book. And I didn't set out to write a book. I actually just set out to keep a journal, and ultimately I decided to turn it into a book. But what sort of happens during the course of the book is that this real sense of acceptance sort of becomes a part of the whole. And a lot of people who have read it actually describe it as uplifting, which is pretty extraordinary. You said it's a hard read, and of course it is a hard read. You're reading about a young man, with a devastating illness, and with a family really sort of struggling to cope. And there will be lots of other families with children, different illnesses, but the same pressures, the same stresses.
And
But
I didn't find it hard to read about Sam, Jill. I found it hard to read about you,
yeah,
because I resonated and I had such empathy for this mother trying to make her child okay.
yeah,
Mm.
Yeah, I know. And I think that that was also part of the process that happens in the book, that, you know, I am able to be kinder to myself by the end of it. You know, I've had letters. I got one the other day saying, from someone saying, I wanted to scream out to you, you know, stop blaming yourself. But, you know, we have to go to these dark places. That is part of grieving. We can't avoid them. And I think, you know, I had to ask myself some really difficult questions, terribly painful questions, but that was part of the process of writing and of just sort of revisiting. And I think by the end, I have found my own answers. And and I think that's where the sort of hopefulness in the book comes, that there is a sense that um, that that even the death of a child is survivable. So I suppose that's what I mean when I say hold on to hope, because I know I already knew actually a number of bereaved parents. When Sam died, within 2 years, I had about 6 people who were acquaintances who went on to lose their children.
Mm.
And it happens a lot more than one thinks. And actually, so all these mothers, I'm talking about mothers, they are out there and they are living their lives, and they are living valuable lives. And actually, it is possible. It doesn't feel like it is when you experience the loss initially. I didn't know whether I would get through it. I didn't know. And in a way, I had to allow myself not to know. But and I think that is part of the sort of shift. The mood, it does change in the book, and I think it is it is quite hopeful.
It's a very, very valuable read. Like Esther Ramsey Jones, she has a lovely book as well, which I started reading at the beginning of the week. And your book is one to be read from cover to cover. It's not one for speed reading, and it pulls you in, like it pulled me in. So I wish you the very best with it, Gill, and thank you so much for talking today. As always, think of the other people out there listening who are going through grief, who needed to hear something of what you've said today, particularly bereaved mothers, I think, or anybody living with an ongoing illness, whether it be mental or physical. Yeah, you've a lot to share, a wealth of wisdom to offer, Jill. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
Take good care.
Yeah, you too.
And with many of these podcasts, there's often a conversation afterwards that's just as rich as the podcast conversation itself. In this case, there was something small that Jill wanted to add in at the end. So here it is.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've discovered, that other mothers are able to take from it, particularly mothers who are going through uh, living with a child with serious mental illness, that actually it gives them hope, that feeling that actually, even if the worst happens, it is survivable. And I got a really lovely letter from a mother with a son with schizophrenia, and she just said, thank you so much for writing this book. It's made me think that perhaps if my son were to die, that that as a family we could survive it, and I could survive it.
Jill, I think I was meant to hear that today, because I actually I take a screenshot of the cover of your book this morning, and I sent it to a mum that I know who is living with a child who has mental health difficulties, and it's a very hard existence for her and for her other son. And I wrote to her and I said, "You've got to get hold of this book. I think it would be great." But I forgot to send the cover of the book. And then as I kept reading the book and it was about his death, Sam's death and
Yeah.
Sam's body and Sam's funeral, I thought, what was I thinking
Yeah.
sending this to her when her child is alive? And I messaged her again. I said, you know what? I forgot to send you the book, but maybe no harm because, maybe it's not right for you after all, and I hope you're well. And I thought, God, that was really stupid of me. But now I think there's another message that might be sent going,
Well,
yeah,
I
maybe do read it actually, because I
yeah,
know she lives in that fear of what's going to happen, what's he going to do, how will he die, will he kill someone, she lives like that all the time. And
yeah,
just to say, when I say that, will he kill someone, that's her fear, something she has.
yeah.
Most people with schizophrenia are not at all um they don't cause
Dangerous.
harm, they're not dangerous.
No,
This is something we see in movies, but it is not true for real
no,
life at all. So
no, it's
um,
not.
when I say that, it's not to perpetuate a myth about mental illness or schizophrenia.
Yes,
It's just that's her specific fear with her son.
yes, yes, absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah. So,
Thank you for adding that bit at
no,
the
not
end,
at all.
Gill. This, uh, you know, nearly after every interview I do with someone, we say thanks and goodbye and good luck, and then I stop recording, and then all this gold comes out, all this wisdom, all this magic, and it's like, damn.
I know. Yeah, absolutely.
But we will pause there.
Yeah.